completely ignores the kind of atrocious role which law plays in colonial societies. But of course, that's perfectly fine. Not that it would have changed fundamentally Hart's argument, but I would have preferred examples from, say, Algeria, India, or other Asian African nations. Now, after getting into this debate, I said that many scholars were trying to modify their ideas of law. So many scholars who really believed in, say, positivism or tried to look at law from a positivist angle, they started revising their idea of law. One of them was, say, Gustav Radbruch. He was not the only one. There were many others. And he said that law has shown fidelity towards nation-state sovereignty and how positivism actually places sovereign at the center of the concept of law. And therefore, Radbruch kind of scholars, they said that now law should have certain moral component attached to it. So every law needs to satisfy at least a bit of morality in order to be called as a law. Now, under this backdrop, H.L.A. Hart was writing about positivism, and not just writing about the key aspects of positivism, but rather defending positivism from the charge that this distinction between law and morality should not be maintained. Now, in this paper, Hart does two things fundamentally. The first thing which he does is that he defends the distinction between law and morality, one. And the second thing which he does is that he conceptualizes his own idea of positivism in defending the boundaries between law and positivism. Now, coming to Hart's paper, the first thing which Hart does in the paper is to ask, what do we mean by distinction between law and morality? When we say that law and morals are two different things, what is the effect of it? What is it that we actually mean when we say that law and morality are two different things? Now, Hart explains this point. He says that when we say that law and morality are two different things, that implies that mere fact that a particular rule violates standards of morality, that does not mean that that rule cannot be considered as law. That's the first implication of this division between law and morality. The second implication of this division between law and morality is that just because a rule is morally desirable, that does not mean that it is a rule of law. So for Hart, at least there are two simple implications of this insistence that there is a difference between law and morality. Now, Hart also tries to get into the reason as to why both Austin and Bentham try to make a distinction between law and morality. He says that the first reason as to why Austin and Bentham maintain the distinction between law and morality is that there is every danger, if at all we conflate these two ideas, that there is every danger that law and its authority would be completely dissolved in, say, man's conception of what law ought to be. Meaning thereby, to put it in simple words, that morality itself is a very indeterminate idea. And mixing law and morality would make law and its authority too indeterminate, and it might lose its effect. The second point which Hart identifies as a justification for maintaining this distinction between law and morality is that the danger of conflating law and morality is that the existing idea of law, if at all we conflate law and morality, may completely replace morality as the final test of conduct and therefore escape criticism. So if we start considering that every law is a moral law, that means that there are less possibilities of criticizing the law because there is already a moral justification behind the law. And therefore the law might replace the existing ideas of morality as a criticism to itself. Now, these are the two major reasons which Hart identifies and attributes these arguments certainly to Austin and Bentham, to say that these are the reasons as to why these scholars try to make a distinction between law and morality. Now, with this, Hart enters into or jumps into the arena. And when I say Hart jumps into the arena, what he's actually going to handle now is many criticisms which have been made against this distinction of law and morality. The first criticism which Hart handles is with regard to conception or the positivist conception of law itself. It says that what are the defining doctrines of this tradition in terms of how law is conceptualized by the utilitarian tradition? He said that there are three elements. There are three central elements as to how law is conceptualized in utilitarian tradition. The first is separation between law and morals. The second is analytical study of legal concepts. And yesterday we talked about what we really mean by these terms. And the third is imperative theory of law, which of course in an Austinian sense, we call it as law is a command or law as a command. Now, Hart makes an important point here. Hart says that these three doctrines or elements, whatever you call them, constitute the utilitarian tradition in jurisprudence and how law is conceptualized. But, and this is something which Hart underscores with strength, that all these three elements or doctrines are independent of each other. The implication of this autonomy or independence of all these three doctrines, that is separation between law and morality, analytical study of legal concepts, and imperative theory of law, is that if you criticize one, that does not mean that others are also open to criticism. So falsity of one of these doctrines does not mean falsity of the other two doctrines. Now, with this fundamental conception, Hart moves on to examine what do we actually mean by command, and why is Hart actually getting into this exercise? Hart is getting into this exercise of understanding the meaning of command because Hart acknowledges the fact that command theory has been extensively criticized in writing, and he goes to the extent of conceding that yes, command theory has certain fundamental problems. And yesterday we talked in detail as to what is the meaning of command and what are the different general criticisms of command. And he comes to the meat of the issue. He comes to the actual issue. And he says that command theory does explain something. This is that command theory, and by now Hart has already explained the problems of command theory. And Hart says that command theory does explain something. He says that command theory explains criminal laws best. But it, for example, fails to explain those laws which, say, confer rights on individuals. He says that this is the distinction. Command theory can be best explained with this phrase, and something which Hart uses extensively in his writing is that command theory literally forces you to say that give me your money or your life. And that is how command theory is placed. Now, such a formulation of command theory can explain criminal laws best, but how do you explain those laws which confer rights with the understanding of command theory? It might be difficult to do that. And it is this aspect which Hart picks up. And here, Hart accepts certain points and Hart rejects certain points. Now, Hart says that, yes, we totally agree with those who criticize command theory, that if laws are merely command, then it is difficult to, say, explain those laws which provide rights. But then, Hart says that I would agree with those critics only up to this point. And the moment those who criticize command theory go on to conclude or go on to argue that the rules of legal system must be connected with that of morality to justify those laws which have rights, Hart denies that charge. Hart says that I am not going to agree with them. Hart says that yes, and maybe I might be repeating this point again, but and that's worth it maybe, that Hart says that yes, command theory has a significant problem, that it fails to explain certain kinds of laws. But in order to explain those laws which command theory is unable to explain, for example, laws which extend right to individuals, Hart says that now the charge that those rights can only be explained with the help of moral rules or principles of justice, Hart says that this doesn't look like a very strong argument. Hart explains his argument or his disagreement with the critics by saying that rules that confer rights, they are certainly distinct from, or they are certainly different from those rules which are a product of command. They need not be moral rules, or they need not coincide with morality. He said that rights are not just part of a legal system. Rights are also part of, say, rules of games. But when you have rights in games, you don't say that those rights are a product of morality. Now, Hart also says that there are numerous examples where we can say that rights need not be just or morally good rules. And he gives the example of slavery, that a master has right over his or her slave. And that also shows that rights need not be moral all the time. And that's how Hart rejects this charge. The second criticism which Hart identified was that of core and penumbra. Now, what do we mean by core? The core would be, say, the literal meaning of a law, and a problem which can be solved with the literal meaning of law. Maybe if you are talking about vehicle, then you interpret vehicle in its literal form and then apply it to a given situation. And if it can be solved, that's like the core meaning of that particular law. And periphery or penumbra would be, say, those who lie at the boundary of any particular rule, meaning thereby that those disputes or those matters which cannot come or which does not look that they can be solved directly by by interpreting the rule in a literal sense. It is this point which Hart tries to make here. Now, in this regard, Hart takes an example. Now, Hart takes the example of a rule which, say, prohibits taking of vehicles in a public park. And Hart says that, now, going by a literal meaning, something which looks very obvious would be that automobiles would not be allowed, meaning thereby cars will not be allowed, trucks will not be allowed. Similarly, other vehicles falling within that category will not be allowed. But Hart asks a counter question. What about a bicycle? Whether it can be considered as a vehicle within the meaning of the rule, which prohibits you from taking a vehicle to the public park. Similarly, roller skates, whether that can be considered as a rule within the framework of, whether that can be considered as vehicle within the framework of the rule. Similarly, toy trains, can it be considered as vehicle within the meaning of this particular rule? The other example which we saw yesterday was a man who is sitting on a bench on a platform, and there is a law that nobody is allowed to sleep on the railway platform. And this man is sitting on a bench, and then he suddenly fell asleep. Now that's one example. And there is this another person who comes and of course puts his blanket on the ground, and then he lies on the blanket, but his eyes are wide open. Now, how will the law interpret this term called sleep, and whether the core idea of the term, the literal meaning of the term sleep or vehicle in the two respective examples can solve all these problems which we are identifying? Now, Hart says that yes, I totally agree with you that formalism or literalism or interpretation through deduction implies a very mechanical idea of application of laws, and it might not solve all the problem. But should we really go to the extent of saying that we need to demolish the boundaries between law and morality to solve such problems? Now, Hart says that such laws can be, or such problems, such disputes of penumbra can be solved in the light of, say, the aim, purpose, or policies which might or might not be moral. And through the invocation of the social aims, the purposes and policies, we might solve that particular issue. But does it really necessitate that we need to break the boundary between law and morality in order to solve such problems? Now, it is in this regard, Hart says that no, that is not the case. We don't need to demolish the boundary between law and morality in order to solve penumbral cases. And he says that, and in so doing, he acknowledges the problems created by penumbral cases and how it significantly hampers the fundamental presumptions of positivism. He says that we can say that laws, and this is his first point, that yes, we can acknowledge that laws are incurably incomplete, and we must decide penumbral cases rationally by referring to social aims. Now, that is an acknowledgement which we all may make in terms of dealing with penumbral cases. And the second thing which Hart identifies, and something which he pushes with strength again, he says that if we really break the boundaries between law and morality, then it would be difficult for us to identify what cases come within the framework of core cases and what cases come within the framework of penumbral cases. We must know about the fact that there are certain issues which a law attempts to cover. Because if we really break this particular boundary, Hart says, then the danger is that the entire notion of rules controlling courts would become senseless or would become futile. Court can apply anything and everything to decide a particular case. Now, Hart goes to the extent of saying that if we really break the boundary between law and morality, that is law as it is and law as ought to be, in furtherance of solving penumbral cases, then all questions would fundamentally become a case of penumbra. And that's a danger we cannot, of course, sustain. And therefore, Hart rejects that argument as well. He is extremely sarcastic at certain places where he acknowledges the pitfalls of positivism, but does not concede to the fact that these pitfalls are because of distinction between law and morality. The third criticism which Hart picks up is that of, say, apparently evil laws, or for example, the example in fact which he takes is that of grudge informers case. Now, without getting into much of a detail, because we did that yesterday, he refers to Gustav Radbruch and how he tries to modify his story in the light of his own personal experience during Nazi Germany and how he himself was a victim of certain Nazi policy. He says that he takes this example of grudge informer's case where this wife was unhappy with her husband. Now, husband was an army officer. He comes home and the wife complains to the authorities that the husband has made certain adverse remarks rather against Hitler. Now, there was a law in Nazi Germany, a 1934 law, that anyone and everyone who makes such statements can be punished. Now, wife was not under a legal obligation to report her husband for making such remarks. But of course, the conduct of husband itself was illegal according to the Nazi law of 1934. Now, the matter reached. Now, the husband was punished. Husband was not executed, though. He was sent to the front to fight battle for Germany in the Second World War. When the war ended in 1949, the wife was being persecuted for what she did to her husband. Now, the specific law for which, or the specific crime for which she was being prosecuted was illegally depriving a person of his freedom. Now, how did the court handle it? Now, there were two competing arguments. Wife argued that her action was justified. It's not that she did anything illegal. Her action was justified under the Nazi law of 1934. But on the other hand, the argument which was made was that that law was immoral and therefore it was not law itself. Now, court agreed with the second argument, and this argument resembles the idea or what has been recognized as Radbruch doctrine, which says that those laws which are fundamentally or apparently evil, those laws should not be or cannot be considered as immoral, as law in the first place. Those laws are immoral and therefore they will not be considered as law in the first place. A precise statement which the court made in punishing the women was that the law of 1934, the Nazi law of 1934, which prohibited such remarks against Hitler or the government, was contrary to the sound conscience and sense of justice of all human beings. And this resembled Radbruch doctrine, and the women was punished. Now, Hart has a problem with this. Hart says that fine, you punish the women, and one might celebrate the fact that women did something evil and she was actually punished. But at the same time, there were other options too, and Hart says that it came at a price. Punishing the women in this case, grudge informer's case, came at a price. And Hart says that there were two other options. The first option was that let women go unpunished. Now, one might say sympathize with the idea and say endorse the view that this might have been a very bad thing to do, but this case would broadly fall under maybe a legal loophole kind of a thing. The second thing which Hart proposes is that enact a retrospective law. Annul the 1934 Nazi law, which prohibited making remarks against Hitler and the Third Reich, and then punish the women through this retrospective law. But then he says that we are losing something very important in this entire process. In the second process, we are losing something very, very important, something which is pious to all legal systems of the world. And that doctrine, or that principle rather, is non-retrospective application of criminal legislation. And he said that it might be apparently bad to pass a retrospective criminal legislation and then punish the women. But he said that we will pursue it openly, and we will pursue it with transparency and the quality of being honest. Now, these are some of the remarks which Hart makes. And therefore, the fundamental argument which Hart seems to be making here is that in punishing the women, a choice had to be made between two evils. And the first evil was that leave the women, or for example, don't punish the women, let her go unpunished. And the second choice was that we might sacrifice a very precious principle, a very important principle endorsed by all legal system of the world, that is non-retrospective application of criminal laws. Now, Hart says he said that there is a danger in what the Western Germany court actually did in terms of declaring that particular 1934 Nazi law as immoral and therefore not law at all. He says that if we engage in such an exercise, and such an exercise here means that based on immorality we consider certain laws as not law, then the danger is that it will serve to hide the true nature of the problem with which we are faced. And the true nature of the problem in this case was that, yes, it was a valid act because there was a law in 1934. And the law continued till Nazi Germany was, or till the Third Reich was in power. And point is something which Hart is emphasizing, that such a situation might conceal the true nature of the problem. It also says that it will also encourage, and he uses this really sarcastic term, that romantic optimism of those who believe that every problem which a legal system faces can be solved through, or can be solved in one single way. He says that will not be good for a legal system to maybe act in such an indeterminate way, and we will be shying away from the real problem if we really don't handle the problem head on. To put it in very, very simple words, because this is such an important aspect, is that what Hart is saying is that unjust laws are also laws. And he says that you may disobey the unjust law. You might say that this is an unjust law and therefore we are not going to follow it. We are not going to obey it. But in disobeying it, just because that law is immoral, you cannot say that it is not a law at all. So we need to make a distinction here. And we need to be very, very clear. We need to be very, very clear in terms of our argument about unjust laws. Of course, there's one or two wonderful statements, of course, which can be open to criticism. For example, the statement which I liked was that when Hart says that when we have ample resources of plain speech, we must not present the moral criticism of institutions as prospectus of a disputable philosophy. And it is this point which Hart is trying to bring home, that unjust laws are also laws. And we would be shying away from the real problem if we use the logic of morality to undo the effect of that particular law in a retrospective form. This brings us to the next idea which Hart has talked about. And the next idea which Hart has talked about, I'm going to speak about it very briefly, where Hart says that could there be a possibility of necessary interaction between a legal system and morality? Now, Hart says that look at all the criticisms which I have been dealing with. Look at the first criticism of those laws which offer rights and are not only criminal laws. And how does morality play a part in that? Similarly, look at the question of core and penumbra. Thirdly, look at the question of, say, what Hart tries to explain with the help of Grudge Informer's case, known as apparently evil laws. Is that, could there be a notion of morality which requires necessary interaction, or could there be a possibility rather which requires necessary interaction between a legal system and morality? And Hart enters this argument through the writing of Austin. And Hart says that Austin at one point of time has stated that every developed legal system contains certain fundamental notions. And Hart would inquire as to what is this fundamental notion which Austin seems to be talking about. And Austin goes further and says that these fundamental notions are necessary and bottomed up in the common nature of man. Now for Hart, there are a couple of problems. The first problem for Hart is to understand whether there are certain fundamental notions which are common to individuals or say nature of man, to an extent where it becomes necessary for a legal system to incorporate certain or to take into account certain moral principles. Now, Hart in this regard talks about this idea of minimum interaction between law and legal systems. Hart takes an example. So the question which Hart poses, for simplicity, let me frame it in question form, is that what could be meant by the claim that certain provisions in a legal system are necessary? That every legal system must have certain provisions, and then those certain provisions can be traced back to the notions of morality. Now, Hart takes an example. Now, Hart says that, and he completely creates a Marvel and DC world here. He says that just imagine a future. Just imagine a world where men become immune or say invulnerable to attack by each other. Nobody is attacked by another person, not for any other reason, but because every person starts living in a hard shell which cannot be broken in order to protect themselves. And they develop such a scientific mechanism through which they extract food from the space through some chemical process which Hart mentions. Now, Hart, by presenting this utopian or futuristic example, Hart says that in such a circumstances, those rules which are extremely fundamental in our times, that is, free use of prohibition against free use of violence or prohibition against use of violence and rules constituting, say, the minimum form of property. Now, these rules would become almost unnecessary in the present world. If the very idea of violence is eliminated because of social reordering, then such rules might become useless. Now, Hart says that in the present world, can you really imagine a legal system without such a rule? Hart says that such rules are so fundamental that if a legal system did not have such rules, say, prohibiting free use of violence, then there would be no point in having any other rule at all. So unless you have this rule or you don't have any other rule. So rules overlap with basic moral principles, say, prohibiting murder, violence, and theft. These are some of the fundamental norms which every legal system would have. This is the kind of necessity we are talking about. But Hart of course does not stop here. He goes one step ahead. And Hart then said that, now going by this example, we can say that all legal systems in fact coincide with morality at such vital points. And we saw when Hart was talking about, yesterday I tried to explain when Hart was talking about Bentham's idea of interface between law and morality at vital points. And Bentham highlighted that how while legislating on a particular issue, there could be an influence of morality. While adjudicating on a particular issue, the court might take into account moral considerations. Now, at this point of time, Hart asks, if at all interaction at such vital point is almost natural, then why not call it as a natural necessity? Why not call it necessary that such interaction should be there? And Hart answers this question because it is not easy to identify the similarities between all human beings. It is very difficult to identify such commonalities or such common attributes which could be deduced from human beings as a whole. And to the extent that we consider certain human traits as natural. And Hart said that yes, there might be few human traits which can be considered as natural. And one of the examples which Hart takes is the desire for survivalhood, for example. This is a natural trait. But Hart says that natural law scholars, they exaggerate this point. Hart concedes to the argument that yes, there could be certain elements which are natural to human beings, but we cannot drag this argument or we cannot exaggerate this argument to the point where we say that all human beings are inclined and devoted to and say united in their aims, say in the pursuit of knowledge and justice for their fellow men. He says that that is not the case. And Hart argues that it is this misconception which natural law scholars have, that all human beings are united in certain attributes. All human beings are equally inclined towards certain aims, that all legal systems should incorporate those aims or attributes. Hart denies this particular charge. Hart argues that above the minimum purposes, and the example of minimum purposes which I said was that how survivalhood could be a necessary natural feature. Hart argues that aims of men in society are extremely conflicting, are too conflicting to extend the argument that there has to be, say, a fuller overlap between legal rules and moral standards. Or, for example, moral standards become necessary in terms of how legal rules are conceptualized. This brings me to another question, and Hart goes back to the question of interpretation, and this is almost very interesting for those scholars, or at least for those students of law who have followed the discussion with regard to interpretation of treaties in 1960s when the Vienna Conference on Law of Treaties took place. And this entire discussion was between two individuals. One was Myers McDougall from United States, and another was Sir Humphrey Waldock from Britain. And now I could easily relate as to why Hart is going back to that specific question and again, because scholars at that point of time were extremely occupied with the question of interpretation of laws. And Hart ends his paper with this articulation of interpretation. Hart says that, yes, that is true, that all factual situations do not represent itself in concrete sense. So all factual situation does not fit into literal conception of law. And therefore, factual situations often demand application of laws beyond the precise meaning or the specific meaning which that law might have. And therefore, Hart said that there are instances when certain rules are to be applied beyond the situations which legislators might have intended, something which would be the case in an ideal situation. Now, in this regard, Hart invokes not an example. So all the criticisms, all the exemplifications of positivism and separation between law and morality we have covered as of now, we see that Hart has tried to handle these questions with the help of examples or illustration. So on the question of, say, core and penumbra, he takes the example of vehicles not being allowed in a public park. On the issue of apparently evil laws, he takes the example of Grudge Informer's case. On the autonomy of central elements of utilitarian idea of law, he takes the example of how such an idea, how command theory believes that either you give me your life or your wallet. Now, here Hart does not take an example. Hart refers to Fuller, and apparently Fuller has referred to one of the best philosophers of his time, Wittgenstein. And there is a very specific phrase from Wittgenstein which Hart uses, drawing from Fuller's article, to explain his point. Now, in this particular paragraph, what Wittgenstein seems to be saying, that just imagine that there is a person who says to another person that, why don't you show the children who are sitting in a particular room a game? Now, the other person to whom this message is given, or to whom this remark is addressed, now what this person does is that he starts demonstrating a game with dice. And then the person who requested the other person to show a game said that I did not mean this sort of game. I did not mean a gaming with dice, because this almost amounts to say, or maybe training children in gambling. Now, this is an example which Fuller has taken, and Hart also draws on this example to further his point, something which we are going to talk about in connection with interpretation. Now, if we follow this example, if we follow this remark, then Hart says that this could be interpreted in three different ways. This entire situation can be interpreted in three different ways. The first would be that we normally interpret not only what people are trying to do, but what they say in the light of assumed common human objective. So it's not just about the fact that the other person wanted children to see a game, but also the fact that there was a larger objective to it, don't push children towards something negative. So in the example which we have seen, unless expressly intended, it is expected that an interpretation of the above remark will not mean introducing the child to, say, a game with dice, which is akin to gambling. Although in general terms, game would have included, say, gaming with dice. But in the light of specific objective which the statement, in relation to which the statement was made, it might not include that. The second interpretation of this entire situation could be that those whose words are interpreted and applied, when it is told to them that, you know what, this is the game we are going to show to the children, the other person say that, although I was not thinking about this game, but now that you are performing that game here, I can say that this is what I meant. So when a person is making a statement, he might not think in precise terms as to what he really meant by that particular idea. But when a particular game was performed there, you would say that, you know what, yeah, this is what I intended, or this is not what I intended. So in the gaming example, the speaker might not have thought of gaming with dice, but when it was introduced to the children there, he realized that he did not intend it. Because the third way is that when it is realized that a particular case falls directly under, say, vaguely prescribed rules, we may provide us, say, a purposive interpretation. Now, what is the effect of this argument? And Hart summarizes it beautifully. He says that the entire effect of this illustration and the three exemplifications which we have seen in relation to that illustration is that in interpreting legal rules, there are some cases which may be seen as natural elaboration or articulation of the rule. So there could be many instances, but there could be some cases which might not fit directly in terms of what the prescribed meaning of the term is, but are natural elaboration or articulation of the rule, to the extent that to think of and refer to this as, say, legislation or making law, something which Austin has suggested, if you remember our yesterday's discussion, on part of the interpreter would be misleading. So that there could be certain instances which might not directly fit into the scheme of things, But going by the nature of that particular case, which Hart uses a new case, the term new case to signify to such cases which does not directly fit into the scheme of things, is that does not mean that it is like making law by judges or a legislation kind of a thing. No, it is just like a natural elaboration or articulation of the law. Therefore, Hart sums up this argument by saying that it would be extremely misleading, and he says that this is what the argument from the other side is, that it's misleading to distinguish between what the rule is and what it ought to be, at least in some sense of ought. So in such a situation, if we really confine ourselves to how literalism or formalism really works, we might not really explain all the cases which Hart calls as the new cases. He says that therefore this distinction between what is the rule and what ought to be rule needs to be obliterated. Hart says that this point might have its own value. Hart said that yes, this point might, and he concedes to this point, but he said that this point has less significance for distinction between law and morality. In so doing, the first argument, or the first caveat rather, which Hart makes is that ought in this case need not have anything to do with morals. He said that ought to be does not only imply morality. He said that there could be other meaning of ought too. So for example, in literal sense, ought also implies or ought also indicates something which is probable. So for example, if I am taking this lecture, then I might say that 60 minutes ought to be enough time to complete this paper. Now, the use of the term ought here does not imply morality all the times. This is precisely what Hart is saying here. So that mere fact that ought proposition may be used to decide certain cases, that does not mean that morality has to step in to decide such cases which are not directly decided by, which are not directly covered by or decided by the exact meaning of the term. Similarly, Hart makes another argument in this regard, and Hart says that if we really use this extended or natural elaboration or articulation of the rule argument, which he says is correct to a large extent, but to demolish the boundary of law and morality would imply that the same logic can be applied by someone who is interpreting an immoral law and who believes in that immoral law. He said that this immoral law is a correct law, and it should be there in the legal system to solve certain kinds of problems. He said that this is what one of the problems could be. Quickly, I'm going to finish the paper. Now, Hart makes a second argument here in relation to the same argument. He said that in practice, we all know that there is not one way of solving a dispute. So that there are always alternatives. So within the framework of law, there are too many alternatives which judge and lawyer may pick in order to advance a particular interpretation. And it cannot be doubted that in most cases of interpretation, there is a choice between alternatives. And it is this aspect which better conveys the reality of the situation. It says that what they have been referring to, what natural law scholars have been referring to, that there is automatically, say, a natural elaboration or articulation of the rule. So that this might be true to a large extent. But in practice, in reality, what really happens is that there are always too many alternatives or too many options to choose from and then decide a case. It says that there is not just one natural elaboration or articulation of the rule. There could be many in relation to the same new case at hand, which does not fit into say, a pure literal application of that particular law. And it is in this sense that Hart completes his argument about maintaining the distinction between law and morality, at the same time conceding that there are certain defects. In positivist idea of law, and thirdly making this argument that on certain points law and morality, they do interact, but mere interaction does not imply that we need to break the boundary between law and morality and say that what is moral is legal and what is legal is and only what is moral is legal. So this is what Hart tries to say. To put it in simple words, Hart is saying that we need to make that distinction between law and morality. And for precise, and we might find problems with the idea of positivism in terms of how it conceptualizes the command theory, how it tries to understand adjudication only in literal or formal sense, where mechanical application of law is often explained. So that there are interactions, but this interaction should not go to the extent of saying that only when a law is moral, it is a law. He concedes to the point that yes, there might be bad laws, there might be immoral laws, but they are still laws. We may disobey them, but we cannot say that it is not law. I think that is what I have understood from the paper. There could be multiple interpretations. I'm open to comments, suggestions, and remarks, and I would invite both Anumeha and Ruchita to maybe share their experience with this paper as well and their preceding readings. Yeah, any comments, suggestions, remarks in relation to what Hart says? All right, I don't know if it was an easy paper or a tough paper. If you understood everything or...
Sir, I had a doubt with regards to what we have been studying so far.
Yes.
Essentially, with this case of the German wife, do we then conclude that morality is essentially it is subjective, but especially vis-a-vis its legality or holding it onto a legal ground? Will this be subjective? And what about individual accountability vis-a-vis the whole Hart-Fuller debate? And because if we are saying that law, if we are also there are so many laws that are grounded in morality and so many that aren't grounded in reality. And I have posed this question to Anumeha ma'am in several of our constitutional law classes as well. But it is for me, it is a very striking example, the example of the Sabrimala verdict, because you see, for the people of the religious sect, it seems to be grounded in morality that women, it is sort of the norm as well that, women not pray and whatever. It is respecting their freedom, their culture. So then how can we essentially say what morality is or define it? And the example with this, since we are also talking about Nazi law, is again of the Nuremberg trials. So that was it's a question, it's a comment. You can take it either ways. But yeah, that is by and large my doubt with the whole Hart-Fuller debate.
Oh, I need to unmute myself. Yeah. So the way I understood you, so maybe you're trying to point out towards the subjectivity which is involved in conceptualizing morality. So am I correct? At least on this particular point. Morality per se is a subjective idea. Yeah.
Sometimes when you ground morality into understanding, especially all the former scholars, do we say that is it a violation of law and not of justice, or vice versa? So that is how I see it.
Okay, can you explain? Can you repeat that last sentence which you said?
Yeah. So essentially, my question is, and if we are also going to talk about the Nazi law,
yeah.
Is it a violation of law and not of justice, or is it a violation of justice as well? Because especially when we're grounding morality into our debates with, and I'm so sorry, I always have these open-ended questions because I I don't get the time to read because of the classes. So this is the essential debate that I've been trying to understand, because despite understanding morality, despite reading all these extensive essays, we still see that morality, especially in the 21st century, if you locate it, it's so different to knowledge systems, to the kind of education one receives or the kind of legal literacy we have. So, then how can we understand it, better? That was what I'm trying to say.
Okay. No, I understood it, maybe. So when it comes to at least Hart in terms of how he is dealing with, say, Grudge Informer's case, and I'll take less time on Grudge Informer's case, and I would personally like to speak more on Nuremberg tribunals, and because I remember you asking a very similar question to Ruchita, and of course she answered it, but maybe I would also try to reflect on that question which I remember. Yes, there is a fundamental problem in terms of how morality is conceptualized in any legal system. Now, one of the major problems with morality, and something which you rightly identify, that morality per se is a very indeterminate idea. As to what would be moral, itself is open to question. Now, law by its very nature requires precision. Now, can we really conflate a precise idea with an imprecise notion or notions to establish a working system in any society? So if law is supposed to work in any given legal order, can we really conceptualize the law in terms of morality? Because every dominant, I'm sure morality itself is a product of dominant belief of any social order. And therefore, there is every danger that if we conflate law and morality, that the morality which is a product of the dominant belief would also color law. So that is one possibility. Nobody denies that. That has been an argument made not just by lawyers but even otherwise. Even Marxist scholars to a large extent would agree with that formulation and would not say that morality should guide how our social relations are going to really work. They would also try to characterize or tamper with the fundamentals of law itself than with the fundamentals of morality in terms of making law good or bad. That's the first point. The second point, of course, and it is in this regard that Nuremberg tribunals become extremely important. And more than Nuremberg tribunal, at least I would say, how Tokyo tribunal becomes important, especially the dissenting opinion of Judge Radha Vinod Pal, a judge from India, who wrote dissenting opinion at the Tokyo Tribunal saying that what you are actually doing here by punishing these Japanese war criminals is nothing but victor's justice. Just because you won the war, you consider that the other person committed XYZ wrong. And you established a system to try these individuals. But if you really want to try people on the basis of XYZ law, then you also need to be tried, for example, what you did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And therefore, Radha Vinod Pal's judgment is a very good example of how there are dangers of conflating law and morality. And these dangers can be located in relation to, say, Second World War itself, where those who won the war, they decided the fate of those who lost the war. But going by the standard of how the definition of, say, war crime against humanity and crime of aggression is placed, and they were equally liable to be tried. Now, the conceptualization of law in a particular way and that conceptualization being based in morality comes with its own danger. And the biggest danger of that point is selectivity. That it would be selective and would be guided by those who are in power. Nuremberg tribunals and Tokyo tribunal demonstrate that it is the victors who will make sure that the other person that the other person is tried for what happened to their soldiers, and not vice versa as to what their own soldiers did to those who lost the war. So I would completely agree with that point that yes, morality might not, and at least going by Hart, this is precisely what Hart seems to be saying, that once you invoke morality to say determine the fate of a law, that law is a valid law or an invalid law, the point is that you are not addressing the real problem, and you are trying to find an answer to each and every question in the same system of laws. That even retrospectively you say that no, that law was invalid without actually following the general procedure of unmaking the law. And it is in this regard that Hart proposes that no, you have a retrospective law and then remove it. Now, even having a retrospective law to undo the 1934 or repeal the 1934 Nazi law, which prohibited making remarks against Third Reich or Hitler, would have posed problems. And the problem which Hart himself identified, that yes, it would have gone against the fundamental principle of non-retrospectivity of criminal laws, but it would have been open. At least there would have been an openness as to how that decision was to be taken. And he said that, or else just let the women go. It would have been bad. We might sympathize that what happened with the husband was extremely cruel, but it fell under some sort of legal loophole. So, to your point in terms of how morality itself is colored by individual subjectivities or subjectivities of the dominant class, I think I would agree with you at least on that point. Maybe when we come to Fuller, when we come to Fuller, we will have more clarity on it. Yes, please. I'm so sorry, Anjali.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you as well, Professor. But actually, like what you mentioned in between, I wanted to comment on that. For example, crimes against humanity or war crimes. Now, this is a very... we see that happening in India. I mean, how can you define war, right? For example, during the Kargil war, it wasn't exactly declared a war, but we know that it was war and there was massive crimes against humanity. So that was exactly my point. It was after the triumph of the the opposition plan of the Nazis. I'm so sorry for getting the term, but that is when they decided to try all the judges. So exactly as you said, and I mean this. I had another question. I'll just refer to one more example. The example of this is of the state versus Nelson Mandela, the Rivonia trial. So you know when they were arrested and held at Pretoria. They were charged with the Sabotage Act. I mean, they were charged with all these acts, which is very similar to what is happening in our country, vis-a-vis regards to sedition law, which again are, positivist laws. So if we were to locate morality, can we then safely conclude that the morality is, to me, it seems like a pointer on a magnetic compass, where, collective society decides where morality leads to, and that is how, that is where laws are actually functioning. So, which is my basic problem with regards to all of this, because isn't law about ensuring that despite a situation where collective morality may otherwise point to some harm being done to XYZ group, person, individual, or groups of people, or just in general, like for example the Aadhaar verdict, which we could say is a more like it's like a group. It's not even a group of person. It's like it exists in a transcendental space. So that is what I wanted to know, because currently, to me, it seems that even with regards to the things that are happening in our country, the sort of morality compass is being fed to violate justice using law. So that is how I would put it. These may be very strong remarks to come off from, but yes, this is basically what I've been trying to understand with the entire argument.
I need to unmute this. Yeah. So I think Hart would agree with you in terms of saying that there are dangers of invoking morality as a test for legality or illegality of law, and how justification for a given conduct lies in morality. Hart would agree with you that it becomes indeterminacy. It also creates a situation where the scope for criticizing laws become constrained. This is precisely what Hart identifies in the initial pages of the paper itself. That once you bring morality close to law, the dangers are rather that the scope of criticizing law becomes less and less. And the law itself becomes a justification for itself if we conflate the idea of law and morality as one. Yeah, so I don't think Hart would disagree with you, and all the examples which you put would broadly, if not completely, fit within that compass. Anumeha, you were saying something.
Yeah. So, because Anjali, you were also talking about the fact that differing moralities may also not lead to justice. I think Hart has been very clear, and when we were reading at least chapter 8 of Concept of Law, Hart makes it very clear that we tend to conflate the idea of justice with the concept of morality, but they are two different concepts. So, and he very specifically says that justice is just one segment of morality. All the aspects of morality does not necessarily concern itself with justice. So when you are basically commenting or claiming that when we are differing moralities may not always lead to justice, I think largely Hart would agree with your argument, because he seems to argue himself that justice is not interchangeable with morality. So there can be some aspects or some moral values which may not be justice, at least from Hart's point of view.
Can you take this discussion further? Actually, I'm getting calls. We have a meeting at 4.
Yeah, perfectly.
And maybe I'll join you in like 5-10 minutes if the discussion continues.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
So, any other further comments or questions that you have? We would anyway be coming back to, I think, Concept of Law once we study Fuller as well.
Yeah, okay. Bye, I'm leaving now.
Yeah, sure, Adas.
Ma'am, I had a sort of a request to make. I don't just confer with me on this, but since this is a subject that is more like located in theory, could we have like more of a presentation based, like, because we are a very small group, we are like 17 to 20 people.
Right.
We have like more of a presentation group because
Been taken completely ignores the kind of atrocious role which law plays in colonial societies. But that's perfectly fine. Not that it would have changed fundamentally Hart's argument, but I would have preferred examples from, say, Algeria, India, or other Asian African nations. Now, after getting into this debate, I said that many scholars were trying to modify their ideas of law. So many scholars who really believed in, say, positivism or tried to look at law from a positivist angle, they started revising their idea of law. One of them was, say, Gustav Radbruch. He was not the only one. There were many others. And he said that law has shown fidelity towards nation-state sovereignty and how positivism actually places sovereign at the center of the concept of law. And therefore, Radbruch kind of scholars, they said that now law should have certain moral component attached to it. So every law needs to satisfy at least a bit of morality in order to be called as a law. Now, under this backdrop, H.L.A. Hart was writing about positivism, and not just writing about the key aspects of positivism, but rather defending positivism from the charge that this distinction between law and morality should not be maintained. Now, in this paper, Hart does two things fundamentally. The first thing which he does is that he defends the distinction between law and morality, one. And the second thing which he does is that he conceptualizes his own idea of positivism in defending the boundaries between law and positivism. Now, coming to Hart's paper, the first thing which Hart does in the paper is to ask, what do we mean by distinction between law and morality? When we say that law and morals are two different things, what is the effect of it? What is it that we actually mean when we say that law and morality are two different things? Now, Hart explains this point. He says that when we say that law and morality are two different things, that implies that mere fact that a particular rule violates standards of morality, that does not mean that that rule cannot be considered as law. That's the first implication of this division between law and morality. The second implication of this division between law and morality is that just because a rule is morally desirable, that does not mean that it is a rule of law. So for Hart, at least there are two simple implications of this insistence that there is a difference between law and morality. Now, Hart also tries to get into the reason as to why both Austin and Bentham try to make a distinction between law and morality. He says that the first reason as to why Austin and Bentham maintain the distinction between law and morality is that there is every danger, if at all we conflate these two ideas, that there is every danger that law and its authority would be completely dissolved in, say, man's conception of what law ought to be. Meaning thereby, to put it in simple words, that morality itself is a very indeterminate idea. And mixing law and morality would make law and its authority too indeterminate, and it might lose its effect. The second point which Hart identifies as a justification for maintaining this distinction between law and morality is that the danger of conflating law and morality is that the existing idea of law, if at all we conflate law and morality, may completely replace morality as the final test of conduct and therefore escape criticism. So if we start considering that every law is a moral law, that means that there are less possibilities of criticizing the law because there is already a moral justification behind the law. And therefore the law might replace the existing ideas of morality as a criticism to itself. Now, these are the two major reasons which Hart identifies and attributes these arguments certainly to Austin and Bentham, to say that these are the reasons as to why these scholars try to make a distinction between law and morality. Now, with this, Hart enters into or jumps into the arena. And when I say Hart jumps into the arena, what he's actually going to handle now is many criticisms which have been made against this distinction of law and morality. The first criticism which Hart handles is with regard to conception or the positivist conception of law itself. It says that what are the defining doctrines of this tradition?